So let me start by saying thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Cody Armstrong, and the topics we're going to be covering today are version control, branching, and merging. It's not just some miscellaneous tools that are associated with these. So really going to focus on how we manage versions in Onshape and how we can manage, branching off into different design variations and merging those back together. So those are the topics for today. As I always say, we really encourage you to ask any questions that you have. So just type them into the questions dialog in the GoToWebinar panel. I'll do my best from time to time to stop and answer each of these questions. If I don't get to yours, feel free to type it in, and I will stick around after the webinar is over and make sure to address them all. So again, ask any questions that you'd like. So version control, branching, and merging, simple topics, and I have a few examples to show you here. Real short webinar here today, not going to be the full hour, but I'd like to walk you through an example of creating versions, branching, merging, and also a tool we call compare that's pretty neat. It kind of ties in with that same theme. So let's get started. Now, before I get into the topic of the day, there are a few things about Onshape in general that I'd like to discuss. So bear with me for just a second. If you're new to Onshape, just some things for the new user to be aware of. The first is our mission statement. That is getting everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere. And this means iOS, iPads, iPhones, Android tablets, Android phones, Linux, Chromebooks, Mac, Windows, really any device that you happen to be in front of, you have accessibility to your CAD data. It also means working collaboratively, which ties in with what we're going to talk about later here today in branching. You can work with multiple people together, in the same document at the same time. So working collaboratively from any device you happen to be in front of. Now, we do consider ourselves professional 3D CAD, and when you think of professional 3D CAD, it's really three pieces. There's parts, assemblies, and of course drawings. And we do have all three major pieces. Some things I like to highlight is that are just a bit different from traditional CAD is that Onshape evolves very quickly. So you're going to see new updates to Onshape roughly every 3 weeks, and you don't have to do anything to access them. Refresh the browser, and you'll see new functionality being added. So we're moving very quickly. We're evolving very quickly in all three of those major components of professional 3D CAD. Some things that make us unique, version control is built in, and that's, of course, what we're going to talk about today. So with Onshape, it's not managed separately or through another application or something else that you have to manage yourself. Version control was built in to the core functionality of Onshape. It was a part of the idea from the very beginning. And so there's a number of things that tie into that, but creating versions and creating those snapshots of the document are what we're going to talk about here today. Some other elements of this that I always like to point out, if you've come from another CAD system, realize that we can import and export a lot of the common CAD formats that you work with today. STEP, IGES, Parasolid, SolidWorks, Autodesk, Creo. There's a number of different formats that we can import from and translate data between. So definitely worth checking out. Onshape works really well, even as a tool to work alongside an existing CAD system. And the last thing I mentioned, I've already discussed it just briefly. With Onshape, we have entirely new methods of collaboration. So if you haven't shared your document yet, I definitely recommend it. A lot of it's going to tie in with what we're going to talk about here today with branching and things like that. But just realize that multiple users can work together. So a lot of the traditional check-in, check-out, who has what file when, a lot of those issues go away. Okay, so what we're going to talk about specifically here today, and it's pretty simple. As I mentioned before, it's going to be a short webinar. We're really just going to focus on really four key things. And the first is, of course, versions. So I want to walk you through creating a version, what a version does, how it works, what are the benefits, why might I do something like that. And then I want to walk you through compare. Now, compare is a tool for, like the name implies, comparing versions or history or two branches. So it very much ties in with everything else in the webinar today. But I'm going to walk you through a simple example of compare and how it can be used to compare versions. And then I want to get into branch and merge. And branch and merge are very much, their own topics. If you're just getting started in Onshape, probably not the beginner level topics. But if you're getting into Onshape in detail and you're trying to build variations, or if you want to allow experiments of designs and things like that, branches are a great way to do that. And then once you've done that, how do we merge those changes with another? So I'm going to walk you through an example of both of those. As I mentioned before, I like to answer any questions that you have. So as we're going through this, feel free to type in any questions, and I'll do my best to stop and address them from time to time. Okay, so forgive me in advance. I do have a few more slides than usual in this webinar. And it's only because I feel it's necessary to explain a lot of the logic and why you would do some of these things in Onshape. So bear with me. The first is version. What is a version? It's important to point out what exactly that means. Excuse me. So a version is essentially a view-only snapshot of your entire document. It's not you can't edit it. It's what's referred to as mutable, but it just simply means it can't be changed. So think of it as a view-only snapshot of everything in the document at that moment. And what it allows you to do is go back and look at previous major milestones. And that's, I think, the key use case here is, I've designed this thing and it's reached a major milestone. Maybe I'm going to production with it. It's quote unquote revision A, or whatever you call your revision scheme. It's the first one. I can create a version to capture this, and it captures the parts, the assemblies, the drawings, everything at once. So think of a version as an immutable or a view-only snapshot. It can't be changed, but it's great for going back and looking at the model and maybe downloading the CAD data as it was at that moment, or any related files. So it's important to point out it's not just for CAD data. You can import a PDF and version control it. With versions. So you can import files and version control them as well. So great for going back and looking at previous revisions and downloading the data as it stood at that moment. Another example of this is if I create a product and it has an instruction manual, and then over time the instruction manual evolves, I can have different versions of the instruction manual attached to my document. So again, not just specific to CAD data. You can go back and download the CAD models or any associated files at a future point. So that's the idea behind versions. It's not. It's very different than history. And if you haven't gone into history before, history is like a step-by-step overview of everything you've done. Versions are considered major milestones, where you've reached this point where you want to be able to go back easily and look at it and maybe view the associated docs with it. Okay, so let's jump into it. Now I'm going to go back and forth just a bit with the slides, but I first want to cover creating a version. And it's a simple enough task. It just takes a moment to show you, but I'd like to walk you through the process just so it's understood. So the important thing to realize with versions in general, and a lot of what we're going to discuss here today, is nearly all of it's accessible from the Versions Manager, which is this little icon here in the top left corner of the document. So you'll select Manage Versions, and you'll see a big button that says Save Version. Okay, so this is the first step in the process. And it doesn't matter if you're trying to compare later on or if you're trying to create a branch, you first have to create a version. Right? So it's not just for capturing those major milestones, but in order to work off of it, to branch off of it, for example, you have to create a version as well. So I hit Save Version, and I give it a name. Right, so this is now revision B. You'll see I have revision A in this from earlier. So you can give it a name, and you can type in a description. Now you can enter anything you'd like here. So I'm using revision B. I think that's a common scheme, but if yours is different, you can enter any string of text that you'd like to capture the name of that version. You can, of course, also add a description. Right, this is the second design iteration. All right. And you can save it. Now, there's one thing I'd like to point out here, and that is the save and edit version properties. You can go in and add individual metadata or properties to individual parts within this assembly. In my example, I have an assembly. So I can add individual part numbers to assemblies or parts within this assembly. I can change the state. There's a number of different things I can do. But again, think of this as capturing the metadata associated with that version that you're creating. Okay, so you can go in and change the details associated with the version properties, so to speak. Okay. And that's it. Once you've hit save, in this case, in the save and edit version properties, it creates a version. And that's again, it's a view-only snapshot. You can always go back and look at that as it stood at that moment. So how do we do that? You'll see in the version manager after I've clicked save that it's added to the list here. So I have revision A, revision B. To look at one of these older versions, all you have to do is left click on it in the list. Give it just a moment and it will load, and you'll get the entire document as it stood at that time. You'll notice, I don't know, it'd be hard to pick up, but there is a PDF that's now missing, right? That PDF only existed in revision B. It didn't exist at this time, right? So now I'm not seeing that tab. So again, it's, what did the document look like at the moment you hit save version? So this is revision A. I can see that the end pieces here are blue. It's slightly shorter. It's, the revision B was quite a bit longer. So you can see some differences between them. But that's all it really takes to create a version. You just go to the version manager, you hit save, you give it a name, and that's it. Now, the key things that I want to point out is to go back and look at a version. You left click on it in the list and notice it says versions or view only, right? You can't change previous versions, again, view only snapshot. But what you can do is you can export. So if I needed Rev A model at a certain, I know that Rev A had a different bolt pattern, for example. I could go back to version A, revision A, export the model at that stage, right? So it's great for going back and not just viewing it, but also downloading the PDFs or the CAD data at that stage in your design. Okay. A question: how did you attach the PDF or import the PDF to keep with revision B? To start off, of course, you can import the PDF into the document. So just real quickly, going back, you can't do any of this now. Right now I'm in a view-only look at the revision A. I have to go up here and click Return to Main, and that takes me back to the main or the latest version. Now, with regard to the PDF, you can import the PDF, okay, from the bottom left here. Just select Create tab, select Import, and browse to your PDF. And through changes over time, you can even right-click and update the PDF. So I can right-click the tab and update the PDF. Okay. A question: if you delete the original file, which I assume means you imported a PDF, for example, and you delete it, if you delete the tab, can it be resurrected? You could go back, restore back to the point before it was deleted, and yes, view that tab. So yes, with history, you could go back to a point where that tab existed in the document and restore back to it. So question, this is a good question. What happens when you make your document public? Does it lose versions? I do not believe it loses versions just simply making it public. Now, if you copy it, that's a different story. Okay, so if you create a copy of a public document, then yeah, the version history data is not going to come across. The history, all those details aren't going to come across. But I don't believe just simply making a document public means you lose the version tree, or excuse me, I should say the versions. So, all right. So moving on, I mentioned before you can update, for instance, individual PDFs or text files, or as I mentioned before, anything that you import into a document is version control. So it's not just for CAD data or drawings or assemblies or parts, it's for anything else. And so again, you could think of a document as a container for the entire project, even the miscellaneous files that are associated with it. Okay, so that's a simple example of creating a version. Again, you go to the Create Versions, you select the Big Save version, and it captures a snapshot of all the tabs in the document at once. And again, just left click and you load that version. Now, what about comparing the design? So what if I wanted a dynamic comparison between this version and the previous version? Or we're going to go over it later. What if I wanted a dynamic comparison between one branch and another branch of my document? And so just spending a moment here on compare, I'd like to walk you through real quickly an example of it, so bear with me. The thing to keep in mind with compare is you get two things really. You get a graphical comparison, which you see on the screenshot on the left there. It just gives you a preview slider, a nice preview slider showing the difference between the two versions or branches or moments in history. But you also get a list-based comparison. So it shows you exactly what features are different, even what edges are different, or what the radius values are different, or you really get a very specific list of the differences. So it's a great tool to compare two versions, but it can also be used to compare two branches or even just two moments in history. I can go back to 6 months ago to, from 6 months ago from now, even if it's not a version, and compare where it is today versus that. So you can compare really almost anything, two versions, two branches, or two moments in history. In this example, what I'm going to walk you through is two versions, of course, but also very useful in those other scenarios. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, the example I have here is a part that's evolved over time, right? So if I look at this part, I have revision A, and if I left click on revision A, it loads it, of course, just like I showed you in the last example. And you can see when it loads it, it is quite a bit different, right? There's not a big boss here. It's much shorter, much narrower. These cuts in the middle are a bit different, but I don't really know what exactly is different. So I can tell that there's a difference between revision A, which is my saved version, and main, which is the most active or latest version, right? So compare is where I want to look at the difference graphically and also with a list. Now the key thing here is you're comparing one version to another. It's important to know what version is active and what are you comparing it to. And there's a very similar example I'm going to go over in just a bit in branching, but so there's almost a from to, kind of example here. In this case, revision A is active. I'm looking at revision A. To compare it to another branch, I could select here and say compare, or I can do the other way. I can select main, which makes that active, and compare that against revision A. In this case, there's not a big difference. It's just flipping around the order, but it's important to keep in mind, comparing this to this, right? In this case, main to revision A, and it's the active to whatever you select, all right? So in this case, we're going to compare main to revision A. We'll select under revision A the compare command, and it does the compare. A question that's come up, and this is a good one, does all the version options work with imported files from other CAD systems? So if I import a SolidWorks file or an IGES or a STEP, and the answer is yes. So you do get that version control. You can update, and it's going to add another instance or another tab to the document. It allows you to manage that separately. So you can do that with imported data as well. Okay, so back to the compare. I mentioned before there's really two things you get here. You get a graphical list, which you'll see here on the left. You get a list, and you get a graphical preview on the right, right? So if I left-click a feature, you really do get a very specific breakdown of the differences. So if I left-click Extrude 1, it shows me, it highlights the differences here on the bottom. So I can see in the main workspace, I have 20 millimeters depth, but in revision A, it was 22 millimeters. So it's giving me a very specific breakdown of the differences between versions. Extrude 1 is not the same between them. The lightning holes feature is not the same between them. Fillet 12 is not the same. And you'll notice fillet 12 in main only has 4 edges, but fillet 12 in revision A had 6 edges. And they were a different radius, 5 millimeters here, 4 millimeters here. So you get a very specific breakdown. And you can also see that fillet 7 exists in revision A, but doesn't exist in main. So that's what this indication is here, whereas chamfer 1 exists in main, but doesn't exist in revision A. Okay. So you get, again, the list-based breakdown. So you get not just, what is different, but exactly what edges, what values are different between them. Then if I close this, left-click that little icon, it closes it, I get the graphic slider. And this is where you get the, the nice transition. If I grab the slider and drag it, between the two versions. Okay, so it gives me a real quick visual. What's the difference? If I don't care about all the features, I just want to know real quickly what's the difference between them. Grab the slider and drag it back and forth. You get a real quick idea of what's going on. A question: does the difference look similar when comparing two imported parts? No, because of course the feature list isn't there. It's a dumb solid, so to speak. So it's not going to behave exactly the same way if the parts were imported versus modeled natively. Is there a way you can modify an old version? And the answer is no. Versions by nature are view only. They cannot be changed. Now, you could, of course, restore the document, and that goes back to a moment where so we can discuss workarounds, but versions themselves cannot be modified. You can't click on one and go in and change it. Does compare work for assemblies? I'm pretty certain the answer is no, not yet. Right now, this is Part Studios, multi-part studios as well. Yeah, I'm fairly certain that that's the limitation for assemblies. Okay, so moving on. That is the compare. Again, the key thing there, knowing what you're comparing, what's active, what are you looking at the moment, and what do you want to compare that to. Now you'll see here I'm comparing main to revision A. So it gives you a little breakdown here, and you can even reverse the comparison. So you can flip it around the other way. One of the most common questions I get when in compares, how do I get out of it? And that is selecting, in this case, main, which is the most active, and that's the one that I want to go back to. So I select main, and it takes me back into the most active, or the most recently changed workspace. So that's the compare tool. Let's move on. Now, the last example I have for you is branch and merge. Now, it's important to point out that, although I'm going to show these together, there are many situations where you'd create branches and you may never merge. So it's important to point out that it's not a requirement to merge your documents. For example, the question often comes up, well, what if I had, I design a certain product and, but I make variations of it. A little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, but very similar designs. And that's a great example of creating branches for each variation. And a great example where you never need to merge multiple branches, right? Because they're just small dimension changes between them. But there are examples where merging makes a lot of sense, where maybe I'm experimenting with different designs and I want to merge two together. So I'm going to walk you through an example of each. But definitely worth pointing out here that you can branch and create as many branches as you'd like and never merge them. Right, so it just depends on what your intent is. A question that's come up: does the version of the assembly create versions of the child parts? It's important to point out when you create a version, it creates a version of everything. All parts, assemblies, drawings, everything in the document gets snapshotted. You create a snapshot of that moment for all parts, assemblies, drawings, and any imported files. So yes, it creates a version at that moment. Okay, so branch and merge. Now, as I mentioned before, there's really a few different scenarios that I see is useful for branching and merging. And one of the most common is, I have a design, maybe it's an initial state, and I need to build a branch to test different things. Maybe I want to test two different base designs for this example. And I want to create two different branches and try them out without affecting my main design. And once I've decided on one, I decide to merge it back into my main workspace. So let me walk you through that process. So here I have a real simple ArborPress Part Studio. So this is actually a Part Studio, but I have the assembly here as well. And what I'd like to do is try out different base designs. So we're going to try out different branches for this. The key thing to keep in mind, one of the most important things to keep in mind with creating a branch is you have to create a branch off an established version. I can't, without creating a version first, create a branch off of it. And that's because in this case, main is always changing. And I can't branch off of something that's always changing. I need an established version that doesn't change, right? So in this case, the first step to creating branches is actually creating a version, right? So I'll create a version. We'll call this our initial version, right? I'll hit save. And now I have an established version that I can create a branch off of. So that's one of the most common mistakes a new user will fall. I don't see branch, it's not an option. Realize you first got to create a version, and then under the gear menu, you'll see branch to create workspace, right? So under initial version, I want to branch off of this with 2 branches to try out different things. I'll select branch to create workspace. We'll call this the square base, right? And I'll hit create. And now you'll see a branch is created off of the initial version called Squarebase. Right? I'll do this one more time. Branch to create workspace, and we'll call this one base with tabs. Okay. Again, create, and now I've got 2 branches based off of that initial version. Again, the main doesn't change. Nothing I've done to this affects the main branch. It's just now I've got these workspaces, these sandboxes, so to speak, to play with the design and not worry about affecting the main, right? Or not worrying about, am I making any big changes? So it's important to point out that although I've created these 2 extra branches, work can continue on the main, right? So all 3 can be working at once, on different things. So I could come in on the main, for instance, and add a fillet down the spine. Let's do a quick fillet, down the edges here. Okay. So now I've made a change to main, and notice it shoots up above the other 2 branches. So you get that visual cue of what's the most recently edited branch. In this case, by default, your default branch will always be called main. You can rename them in here if you'd like, but just keep in mind, it's just a default name, right? It doesn't mean anything in particular. The ones you create, of course, have a meaning. So in this case, I've edited main. It's now at the top of the list. I have square base and I have base with tabs. And what I'd like to do is go in and change those designs up a bit, right? So I want to have different variations. Maybe it isn't the idea that I want to merge them, but I just want to have 2 different offerings of my product. They're very similar with a different base. So let's go into the square base. I just left click and it loads the square base branch. Notice the fillet I added a moment ago is not in this branch. So you do not see that fillet here. It only exists in the main branch. And so now what I'd like to do is modify some features, right? And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to change a few quick features. What we can do is just jump into our sketch here, or excuse me, our feature. And I'm just going to change our initial extrude to include a few more things to make it look like a square base. Okay. And this is pretty easy because I can just come in and select the different contours of the sketch. Okay, so bear with me for one more moment. There we go. And so now I've created, by just editing the extrude really, a square base version of this. I'll hit the green check. And now my base is square, right? So again, jumping back to the versions manager, you'll notice square base has shot up as the most recently edited branch, right? So now I have square base complete. Now what I'd like to do is edit base with tabs, right? So I've finished, my modifications to the square base design. Let's take a look at the base with tabs. I left click. You'll notice again that it goes back to this similar base that the original design had, right? It does not have that square base that we just modified. So again, different workspaces, different branches entirely. So now what I'd like to do is we'll roll back to just above the shell. And what I'd like to do is add a few tabs. So we're going to do a whole new extrude. of 1/4" tabs early on in this design. Okay. So all I'm doing is taking an existing sketch, extruding, adding one more extrude for some tabs. Okay, so I've rolled back. We'll go ahead and roll to the end. And now I have my base with tabs. Right, so 2 different base designs in different branches, right? So if I go into them now, you'll see base with tabs is the most recently modified. Square base, if I were to left click on it, you'll see the base turns to a square. If all I'm looking to do is build these different variations, creating branches is enough, right? I create a few branches, I modify the designs, and I have those independent workspaces to capture all these different variations. But what about merging all of this together? What if I wanted to take base with tabs and the changes that took place there and merge them with the main branch or the main workspace? So I wanted to discuss that whole process. But again, important to point out, if all you're trying to do is build variations of your model, creating branches is enough. You have these independent places to modify it and not worry about affecting each other. Also very useful, for instance, when I share a document. If I share a document and, for instance, 2 people want to try out different design variations, 2 branches for each person is a great way to do that, to establish that. So a number of different examples I could give you for branches, but just realize that you do not have to merge. You can create as many as you'd like for all the different design variations that you'd like. And then, what about merge? And we're going to cover merge in just a second. Real quickly, can you merge branch to branch? Absolutely. And the way to think of how we merge is how we merge, very similar to how we compare. What are you merging from, and what are you merging to? I can merge base with tabs with the square base if I chose to. It just depends what's active and what am I selecting under merge. And I'm going to walk through that in just a second. Now, there is some details with merge that I think are really worth pointing out, and I'm going to spend a moment to do that. A very good question has popped up. Do you have the ability to control which branches are shared? And the answer is no, not at the moment. And that is definitely something we recognize as being important. Right now, sharing is a document level thing. So I can't share one branch and not another. So definitely worth pointing out. It would need to be in a different document to do that. But we definitely recognize the need. So okay, we've gotten into branching. You create a branch. Anything you do in that branch doesn't affect any of the others. It's a fairly simple concept. You can even import and create additional tabs. You can import different files, and it only impacts that branch that you're in. But what happens when you want to merge these branches together? And so there are a few important things I want to point out with this. And the most important, is probably the most common question we get with this, is what happens if there's some kind of a conflict between the 2 branches? And so I want to take a moment to discuss this. So bear with me for just a second. Just to recap real quickly, branches. You can only branch from a defined version. So again, just like I mentioned before, the first step is creating a version. It creates an independent workspace from all the others, so you can make any changes you'd like, and it doesn't impact anything else. You can even go as far as importing tabs, deleting tabs, and all of that. It only impacts that branch. So again, great for building variations or collaborating and giving each user their own sandbox, so to speak, to experiment. But what about merging? Well, the key things with merging, the idea behind merging is you take 2 different designs and you merge the features together to create one. And for those that have done some complex modeling, know that there's potential for error there. What happens if this and what happens with that? So I'd like to walk you through the ideal scenario and what happens if there's a conflict. So first, the ideal scenario, you have the active workspace has just a block with a hole in it. The workspace you're merging from or to, in this case, is just a block with fillets around it. The result is, of course, a block with fillets and a hole. So it's just combining the features, right? The fillet carries over, but of course the active hole, gets pushed to the end result. The key thing with merging is understanding what's active and what are you merging from. And so the analogy I often give is a from to. I want to merge the changes from the base with tabs in our example to main. So let me show you what a less than ideal scenario. Let's say that you have a conflict. So here the active has chamfers. The branch I'm merging from has fillets. You'll notice on the same edges. So obviously the two can't exist at the same time in the end result. How do we handle those situations? And it's important to point out that the branch you're merging to wins in the conflict of a feature war. So you'll notice I have chamfers here, fillets here. Because this is the active branch, it wins in the conflict and the fillets have an error. You'll notice the feature list here, corner fillets has an error. So it's worth pointing out there will be scenarios like this where the same edge is filleted or chamfered or something along those lines where there is a conflict and the difference is determined by what's active and what are you merging from. Okay, so let me walk you through another example of this. But one last slide. Onshape looks at the features that have been edited and applies the order based on to and from. The active will win when there's a feature conflict, just like the fillet example or the chamfer example I just gave you. However, if there's a dimension conflict, if one dimension is bigger in one versus another, it's the opposite, right? Because that's what I'm merging from. I'd expect the dimension changes to carry over. So dimension values from the other branch will carry over to the active, but feature conflicts, it's the opposite, right? They come first in the list, and of course, I don't want what I'm left with, the merged result, to have a lot of failed features because of conflict. So there is an odd scenario for a tie, but it's very, very rare. So just realize that there is a potential for that, but it's extremely rare. So much so that I wouldn't worry too much about it. Okay, so that is the merging logic. Now let's walk you through an example of it. Now, I mentioned before, it's very important to understand what's active and what am I merging to and from, right? So in this case, base with tabs is active. That's what I'm looking at. You'll see it's kind of highlighted here in the versions manager. So I can merge other things with this. I can merge main with this by selecting it here. But in my case, what I really want to do is I want to merge base with tabs to main. And so again, I use a from to analogy. I want to push the changes from base with tabs to main. And that's really the way to think of it. Now, the first step when I want to do that is selecting the active. In this case, I want to change the main workspace. So I highlight, I select main. That makes it the active branch. Then all I need to do is go into the branch I want to change from, in this case, base with tabs. I want to push the changes from here to main. So I go up to base with tabs, and I say merge into current workspace. So that's really the key. Under the gear menu, you'll see merge into current workspace. That will push the changes from base with tabs into the main branch. So now you'll notice the main branch has tabs. Okay. So a very important thing to point out, it does, take the changes that have occurred from there and then push them into the active workspace. Okay. Okay, so that is merge. A few minor things to point out real quickly. A question. And this is something that's been brought up before, and it's a very good question. When merging, can a graphic be added to show where branches have been merged? And this is definitely something that we're working on. So this is a very good point. If I go back to the version manager, there isn't a clear indicator that this was merged with that. That's something we're working on. Right now, we only give you what is the latest edited branch. But in the future, we hope to make that a little bit more clear that this was merged with that, for example. But that's merge. The key things to keep in mind with merge is there will be situations where you have a conflict and one will fail because of it. Now, the entire merge should not fail. But you may have a situation where a chamfer fails, right? Or a fillet fails because the two features are conflicting in the various branches. Okay. Question. This is all within a multi-part studios, not the assembly tabs. Does this work with assemblies? Absolutely. All of this applies to the entire document, not just parts, assemblies, drawings, everything, even imported data is considered here. So yes, this works with assemblies. Do you recommend using multi-part studios to build up assemblies instead of using Actionable Assembly tab? You can't build parts in an assembly in Onshape. The idea in Onshape is you're building multiple parts together in a multi-part studio. So we may be just talking about a distinction of a few names, but in Onshape, I can build an entire, all these pieces together in one part studio. But it's not an assembly. An assembly is only about motion. Now, whether you choose to model this way or model individual parts and then assemble them is up to you. I certainly prefer building with parts and in contextual relationships to each other like I've done here. Okay, so in multiple users, is it possible to limit the permission so only authorized person can release a version? No. This is a good question. If I have multiple users, is it possible to limit who can create a version? Now, if they have view-only permission, they won't be able to do that. They won't be able to create a version. But if they have edit permissions, we don't have a way to say edit but not be able to create a version. So I think view-only is the only thing I could think of. Now, obviously, view-only is pretty limiting, can't edit the model. But right now, we don't have the ability to say edit without being able to create a version. Good question. When you copy the tab to another document, will the branch also be copied? It copies the active. It does not copy the branches of that part, for example. It's very similar to the copy workspace, essentially. So when you copy a tab using the right-click copy to clipboard, it does not copy all the different branches of the part, only the active. If parts are removed in one and new ones in the merged file can be replaced in the merge. Forgive me, I'm not sure I totally understand, Roger. If you remove from one and merge, it would be removed from the merged instance as well. If you remove a part from a branch. Again, it's all about the from to, which are you merging, what's active and what are you merging from. Where would I go to figure out how to correct merge errors? This is a very good question. It could be constraints, dangling references. It could be parts failing, features failing. There's a number of different things. The one thing I would say is mouse over a feature and take a look at the error, and then take a look through help. But something that we've thought about before is creating a video specific to troubleshooting or diagnosing errors. That's definitely something that we could do in the future. Right now, mousing over the feature and then getting the feedback from the tooltip is the way to diagnose an error. We do have some videos on sketch constraints. I have, for instance, a video on specifically sketch constraints. But again, using the tooltip is a useful way too. Could you also merge both branches back into main if you wanted to? You could not do them in one shot. You could do two separate merges. But you have to be careful about what's active and what's from and to in those situations. But absolutely, you can do two different merges if you choose to. A question. You have a nice tool for comparing two versions with a list of changes. Why don't you use this for merging? Accept or don't accept individual features and changes. This is a very good question. You can compare two branches. I mentioned that before. So I can figure out what's going to change between them before I merge them. But the ability to accept or don't accept individual feature changes is something we don't have yet. That's something that has been requested before, the ability to selectively merge, so to speak. Right now, it's just all onto one, onto another. Um, so definitely something that we're looking at for the future. Another question, a bit off topic, but that's fine. Not very related to this webinar. Is it possible to make a document private again after it's been made public? Absolutely. If you go into the shared dialog, the public, if it's made public, you'll have it make private, right? So I can make public and then uncheck, right, check the X next to that, right? So once you make it public, you'll see it in this list. If you hit the X next to that, it's now private again, okay? And that, by the way, goes for all sharing. So if you share with an individual, you'll see their name in this list. If you hit the X next to their name, they no longer can see your document, right? So you're essentially unsharing if you want to think of it that way. Question, do the properties you enter when saving new version have effect on functionality, or is it just metadata? At the moment, it's just metadata. This is something we hope to improve upon and use in a number of different ways. At the moment, you're just capturing metadata associated with the parts within that version. So definitely future plans for that data, but as of today, just capturing the metadata. Okay, that is really what I had planned. I have one last thing for you. If you're just getting into Onshape, really encourage you to try Onshape in your professional work and let us know what you think. Give us feedback. There's a feedback mechanism built into Onshape to try and make it easy for you. Let us know what you think of Onshape. Try it out and don't hesitate to give us feedback. The other thing is invite others and share. I've shown you before. Definitely worth trying out. Branching is a great example of it, where I can create these independent workspaces. But you can work simultaneously. You can add comments. You can, all do all these collaborative things within a document. The last thing to mention is if you've been using Onshape a while and maybe you're interested in meeting local users, we'd really love to hear from you. If you're interested in establishing your own user group, we'd definitely love to help you set that up. So that's what I had planned. I'm going to stick around and answer any questions that you have, so feel free to type them in. But that's it, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.